Morning, everyone. We're in historic times, and the responsibility on all of us to act in the national interest weighs heavily. Yesterday, as the Prime Minister clouded her own proposal for leaving the European Union with yet more uncertainty, there was one shaft of clarity: the ruling from the European Court of Justice that the United Kingdom can still decide unilaterally to revoke Article 50 and stay in the EU on the same terms we now enjoy. Our fate remains in our own hands. In recent days, three of the most important actors in this drama have, with varying degrees of intent, opened up the pathway to what now appears to be the only way forward. Theresa May, announcing her proposed deal on the steps of Downing Street, said that the alternatives were either to leave with no deal or no Brexit at all. And yesterday in the Commons, she told MPs they need to face the fact that there will be a choice between a deal, no deal, and no Brexit. We don't doubt that the Prime Minister has set her face against both. But given her repeated suggestions that both are possible outcomes to this crisis, it would be the height of irresponsibility to prepare for one and not the other. Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, yesterday reiterated there was no prospect of renegotiating the deal, but has stated that if it's rejected, the only options remaining would be no deal or no Brexit at all. I want to reassure you that the EU is prepared for every scenario. We recognise Mr. Tusk is heavily invested in this deal, but today we seek clarification from him about how he'll help the UK's democratic system to prepare for a public vote in which staying in the EU is on the ballot paper. And the third pivotal figure in this evolving crisis is Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of my party. In an interview on Sunday night, he confirmed that the Shadow Cabinet will decide, perhaps today, on when to table a motion of no confidence in the government. Our policy, agreed by our conference in September, is to examine all options remaining on the table, including campaigning for a public vote with an option to remain, should we not be able to secure a general election. And in his interview on Sunday night, Jeremy was asked if staying in the EU would be on the ballot paper, and replied, there has to be an option there of what's on offer. We still don't know what would be on offer. At the moment, we've got this deal, which doesn't look as though it's going through Parliament. So today we're making a similar challenge to all three of these participants. To the government, calling on ministers now to begin preparations for a people's vote, including drafting the legislation for the public to be given a final say, which the Prime Minister admits is a realistic outcome to this crisis. To the European Union, we're calling on it to begin discussions on Thursday to extend Article 50 so that our democratic process has time and space needed to explore that option, outlined by Mr. Tusk, of the UK deciding to stay. And to Jeremy, we're asking that in the days ahead you think very hard about adding your signature to those of the other leaders here today to table a motion of no confidence, so that if we can't get the general election that we want, you can campaign for the people's vote that Labour's members and voters so desperately desire. Mr. Cable.
Well, Margaret, I think the two of us are sort of veterans of the 1975 campaign. I think we were then on different sides, but we're now united in this call for a people's vote. I mean, it's very clear. I mean, the country, business community, others, are absolutely crying out for clarity and stability about where we go, and we've been plunged into a major constitutional crisis, in effect. Now, the evaporation of confidence in the government, its inability to make decisions, cancelling the vote yesterday was an extraordinary act of panic, running away. And the situation isn't going to change in the next few days. The European Union has made it absolutely clear that there is going to be no fundamental negotiation. If something important was changed, Irish backstop, something else would have to change that would be very unfavourable to the UK. The greater likelihood is that we just have cosmetic changes which don't change any views in the UK. And because we have a major constitutional crisis, that was the reason I yesterday, and also this Savile Roberts, argued for a no-confidence motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition, and my colleagues will say a little bit more about that in a moment. The one issue I do want to focus on is the responsibility the government now has to do some serious contingency planning for the fact that we may get into a no-Brexit situation via a people's vote. Calling on somebody to do contingency planning doesn't necessarily mean that it's something they like. I spent my years before Parliament doing scenario planning for a big international oil company, and the whole philosophy we had is that you prepare for what might happen rather than necessarily what you want to happen. And the Prime Minister has been very, very clear that there are three options as she sees it. There's her deal, there is no deal, and there's no Brexit. And we've got plenty of contingency planning, so we're told for a no-deal scenario. In the budget statement, there was a commitment to spend, I think, £4 billion, staggering amount of money, in all kinds of preparations. The Cabinet has been meeting, discussing how to allocate foodstuffs and medicines on continental ferries. I mean, it's an extraordinary degree of planning that's taking place. But no planning appears to be taking place for a people's vote, which is now, we believe, highly probable, not simply because we say so. If you go into bookmakers, I think you now get evens on the fact that a people's vote may well now happen. And for that reason alone, they should be preparing for it. And it does require preparation. We need to be alerting the Electoral Commission to its responsibilities. Only the government can do that. And we need to be preparing for time in Parliament to have a proper legislative debate, which will be required. I mean, there are important issues to be resolved around the franchise, who should vote, the timing, the question that has to be asked. We're very clear that there has to be a choice, including a binary option, of which one choice is to remain within the European Union. But that has to be legislated for. It does require preparations. And so our challenge to the government is actually to get on with those preparations. They may not like it, and that they may have no choice but to bend to the will of Parliament and the people and carry out an instruction to have a proper people's vote. Thank you.
Caroline.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Vince. And I'm very pleased to be here today alongside my fellow Westminster leaders from Plaid Cymru, from the SNP, from the Liberal Democrats. And I think together we've all got a very clear message for the Prime Minister. And that is that her government has failed, that there is no majority in Parliament for her Brexit deal, or indeed for any deal that would make us poorer, that would undermine our living standards, that would undermine our environmental protections. We have no majority for a Brexit that betrays the hopes and dreams of young people who will live with the consequences of our decisions far longer than anyone else. We say very clearly that the will of the people cannot be undermined by a vote of the people. And that is why we need, and the country is crying out for, a people's vote. But a people's vote isn't about the status quo. It's about radical change as well. Because I believe that those Brexit voters who voted leave because they believe that the status quo in this country is intolerable were right. In many ways, it is. We are a country of grotesque inequality. Far too many people are living in communities with proud histories, but which have been hollowed out by decades of deindustrialisation and neglect. Last year's Social Mobility Commission report identified 30 places with the worst social mobility. And I don't think it's a coincidence that every single one of those voted to leave. But the lie at the heart of the Leave campaign was that that downward spiral can be reversed by leaving the EU. The opposite is the case. The truth is that Brexit would make things much, much worse. So the real answer lies in far-reaching reform at home. And we need a new social contract, better jobs, high-quality investment in our public services, investment in the green economy, with people of all backgrounds and communities treated with respect and given the opportunity and the power to thrive. And we need to ensure that the net economic benefit that we know that people from other EU countries bring to this country, we need to make sure that that funding is spent in those areas that experience the largest changes on projects that are collectively decided by local people. So it's not enough, we know, simply to demand a people's vote. We have to demand a better Britain that could function more effectively within a reformed EU. And we must urgently commit to addressing the grievances that were aired during the 2016 referendum, and as I say, campaigning for far greater public investment in those regions that need it most, and towards working towards a Britain where people have a real say in the decisions that affect them. So we're not defending the establishment. What we are doing is saying that we need radical change, and that is why I am reaching out to Jeremy Corbyn. That is why we are all reaching out to Jeremy Corbyn today, because we know that the Labour Party wants that kind of change as well. We know that its leadership, its MPs and its members are also passionate about social inequality. Now, I count Jeremy Corbyn as a friend and a colleague. We've been on countless platforms together. We share many values. And I've always been crystal clear that the People's Vote campaign is not about replacing him as a leader. It's not about, for heaven's sake, another party. What it is about is tackling together the real problems that affect this country and which right now are going to be harder to address if we go ahead with Brexit. So we need to build a genuine shared movement with no other goal than security and the well-being and the prosperity of every single person in our country. The government has demonstrated its singular inability to pass a Brexit deal through Parliament. So today we are calling on the Labour Party, on Jeremy Corbyn, to take the initiative as the official opposition and to call a vote of no confidence as soon as possible. It is clear that the Prime Minister has failed to live up to the noble ambitions that she set out on the steps of Downing Street when she first took on this job. Her party has once again allowed its internal divisions to cause untold damage to the country as a whole. Her government has mismanaged negotiations with the EU and it's plunged us into a crisis while providing no clear way forward. And that is why a vote of no confidence is needed as soon as possible. And if it fails, then we need as soon as possible to be able to move forward to the people's vote that we know that the majority of Labour members want, that their party conference adopted as policy. That is why this is urgent, and that is why we are calling on Jeremy Corbyn to support and to put down that vote of no confidence as soon as possible.
Thank you, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here today with figures from a number of parties all working together, I think, in our shared interests. These are deeply worrying times for all of us who care about the special and the enduring bonds between us and our European allies. With only weeks left before the UK is due to leave the European Union, the Brexit process in Westminster is in gridlock, and the UK is in the middle of a constitutional crisis that is unparalleled in modern history. Staring at certain and heavy defeat in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister has postponed the vote on the withdrawal agreement with no date set for its return. There now appears to be scant potential for consensus to be found in Parliament for any form of Brexit that will meet the promises made in the last referendum or be as good as a deal that we already have from the European Union. And we know exactly what the Prime Minister is up to, because we're now aware that we may not be looking at a vote until getting close to, if not on the date of the 21st of January next year. And we should be very aware of the threats that come from that. Because what the Prime Minister is seeking to do is to make this a binary choice between her deal and no deal. And we should be saying quite unequivocally that that is completely unacceptable. And the missed opportunity that we've had from today, where we know that the Prime Minister's deal would be voted down, we know that the House of Commons would demonstrably show that there's no appetite for a no deal, and the fact that we don't have that opportunity that we should have had to move on to a discussion on a people's vote is something which is completely unacceptable. And that's where the position of leadership comes in. I respectfully say, and I would echo what Caroline has said, our message to Jeremy Corbyn is all of us have to work together to move that motion of no confidence. And I appeal to Jeremy to do that. But all of us working together have got to accept our responsibilities. And if Jeremy can't put himself in that position, then we as the leaders of the other opposition parties must rise to that challenge. And we must lay down that motion of no confidence in the Prime Minister. But let's come back to where we are. Consulting people across the UK through a people's vote is a process that cannot and should not be unduly rushed, but we have to move on to that as soon as possible. Today we are calling on European leaders to allow for an extension of the Article 50 timetable, to allow the United Kingdom to go through a democratic process as a sovereign UK state that could culminate with a result that would be at the benefit of the entire family of European nations and its people, the United Kingdom staying in the European Union. This matter is a matter, I hope, that would be discussed by European leaders at this week's Council Summit. And in time, we would hope that such a request be made to allow the necessary time for a democratic process to play out, that it would be looked upon favourably by our allies and friends in the European Union.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Mae'n anrhydedd i fod gyda ynghyd arweinwyr yn eich chi heddiw. It is an honour to be here with my fellow leaders and representatives of the other opposition parties and to be addressing you today. And I think what will have struck all of us is the degree, of course, that we live in divided, divisive times, our role as politicians and how we deal with these issues now. And I think, back in my constituency in North West Wales, this is something that will be discussed in the pubs, in the village halls, be discussed in the schools and the colleges. And I think we discussed amongst our families, and we all know that there are places where we don't go with these conversations. I am thinking of my own family here as well. And there is, we've seen these fault lines, and I think it also represents a challenge for our politics and a faith lost in politics and a media that has delighted for so long in using politics as a scapegoat and in using Europe as a scapegoat. And this, of course, is one of the challenges that is thrown down to us as the representatives of the People's Vote campaign. People are told there are strong feelings out there, that we shouldn't be stirring up greater divisiveness. But in all honesty, this is the only campaign, the People's Vote is the only campaign that is getting hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets. And these marches, they are led by young people, aren't they? Young people who now feel that their voices have been ignored, they haven't even had an opportunity, that democracy so far has not served them well. Now, these young people will be voters for a very long time indeed. And this will be the cause that signifies their right of passage as voters into democracy. And they will neither forgive nor forget. And, of course, the fury which many Leave voters felt, and which we are told time and again was addressed towards the establishment 2 years ago, of course, these were causes that were nothing to do with Europe. And in all honesty, I think we now need to be looking at, in all honesty, how is our politics here going to be dealing with those issues of social justice, of poverty, of ingrained inequality across the nations of the United Kingdom? And the EU must surely now be part of the solution and not be the scapegoat to this. And just to close, there is room for passion, surely. Surely this year, that's the centenary since the end of the First World War. for the great success in peace, the project for peace which the EU represents. Surely we should be celebrating that. Surely it is a tragedy that it is EU leaders who are standing up for peace in Northern Ireland better than the UK government, more effectively. The EU is not perfect, but it is in the EU, and I speak from Wales here, that we have seen the most determined steps taken to address social inequality. I want to keep those steps. I want to seek to strive against social inequality in the future. We deserve better, and it is with the EU. The EU is a political construct. It isn't perfect, but we can work to make it better. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
It's just about good afternoon, everybody, because it's now on midday. Look, I just want to sum up, if I can, and reach some conclusions. I think it's the first time that we've all come together in this forum. I'm absolutely delighted to stand here with the leader of the SNP, Caroline, I was going to say as ever. We've been here many times before, obviously Vince as well. Wonderful to see Liz here from Plaid, and of course to welcome hugely Dame Margaret Beckett, a serious stalwart of the Labour Party, hugely respected across all parties, and rightly so, who made one of the best speeches last week in the House of Commons. And what you are hearing, and I hope you have got these messages, it's now time for everybody to begin to plan for a people's vote. We've heard it's the job of the government to plan for a people's vote, the job of Her Majesty's opposition to plan for a people's vote, and of course the job of the EU as well to plan for our people's or public vote. You know what? I don't care what you call it, it's all about what it delivers that's most important. Because I think ordinary people, having witnessed what happened yesterday, are in a mixture of just being appalled, slightly embarrassed about what happened yesterday, and finding themselves in a situation whereby they despair at the state of British politics. And they will despair at us as parliamentarians, though we are willing and want to step up and play our part. We always have been. This is actually nothing new, and many of you as commentators will know that many of us have complained from the very outset that Parliament has always been excluded from the Brexit process, and trying to help to shape and find a way of reaching a pragmatic consensus. Every single person here has tried and has called to be part of that process in the last 2.5 years. And at every twist and turn, Parliament's been excluded, and yesterday was the culmination of that, and that is not good enough. So we want a people's vote for all the reasons that most of you are very well familiar with. But it's not just about getting, it's the only way now for the government to get out of this unholy, unprecedented mess. But it's actually an opportunity for the British people to have what I think they have a right to have, and that's a final say. Now they know what Brexit looks like, and now they, I think, begin to appreciate that the current deal that we have with the EU is the best deal we can ever get, for all the reasons which you know and have been well rehearsed. People are entitled to that final say. They are entitled to change their minds. And young people who were denied a say in 2016 absolutely have a right to a say, because they will bear the burden of a bad Brexit more than anyone else. And I just finally want to conclude by saying this, again, where we absolutely agree. It's not going to be a rerun of the referendum. It's a people's vote on Brexit, and it'll be positive in this sense if we get this people's vote. We will campaign very differently than the old Stronger In campaign. One, we will make it very clear that we want, as part of our campaign, as Caroline said, actually to deal with the very issues that drove so many people to support Brexit. And secondly, we will make a positive case for membership of the European Union and Britain's continuing role in reforming it so it delivers for everybody.
You'll probably appreciate that we're quite tight for time, particularly because colleagues want to get back to the House for the debate. So if I could ask those who want to ask questions to identify themselves and to be brief. Yes. Yes.
Hello, Michael Settle from the Herald. A quick question to Ms Soubry. Why should people accept a people's vote that returns a majority to stay in the EU when you haven't accepted the people's vote, the biggest in the country's history, to leave the EU? And if I can ask, ping a quick one to Mr Blackford. Your side lost the Scottish independence vote in 2014. Your side lost the UK-wide EU vote in 2016. Why shouldn't people think you're just a bad loser who doesn't respect the will of the electorate?
Well, I'd like to say, first of all, I voted to trigger Article 50, and when I made that decision to support the triggering of Article 50, I absolutely did believe that we could form a consensus to deliver on the referendum result whilst protecting British business and making sure there was no return of the hard border in Northern Ireland. And that was why I always supported us remaining as a member of both the single market and the customs union, and voted accordingly on both those matters. The reality is that as things have gone along and the Prime Minister put down her red lines, it became absolutely clear that that was never going to happen. And as we now know, actually the debate has shifted enormously. So where there was once a consensus for what we call Norway Plus, lots and lots of my colleagues have now come to the conclusion that it's something they absolutely couldn't support because of the fact it would make us a rule taker as opposed to a rule maker. That boat has now departed. And for me, especially as I've learned more, frankly, about Brexit, I've come to the conclusion it's absolutely right for it to go back to the British people. They have a right to have that final say. Now they know what Brexit looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. Actually, I think there's something very interesting that Anna said there, that she's learned more about Brexit, and that is the fundamental point. And that when you look at the UK government's own analysis, and in every possible Brexit scenario, people are going to be poorer. People are going to lose their jobs. And sad to say, if that becomes the reality, it is the government that will be responsible for putting people on the dole. And each and every one of us as parliamentarians, first and foremost, have got a responsibility to look after the economic interests of our constituents. We simply could not go through the lobbies and support any proposition that is going to make people poorer. And on the basis that when the facts have changed, when the knowledge of what would happen with Brexit is there, it is only right and proper that people are given that opportunity to reflect on it. And just finally, very briefly, Michael, you asked about being a loser. Let me say to you that we accepted the result of the referendum in Scotland in 2014. But we were also told at that time that if Scotland stayed within the UK, that our place as EU citizens would be respected. So there's a change in those circumstances. And what has happened in Scotland, because we've got a parliament in Westminster that is very, very badly divided. But in Scotland, the SNP, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens came together last week in passing a motion. And we're simply not prepared to sit back and see Scotland being dragged out of the European Union against our will. There is perhaps a wider issue that I will work and we will work with colleagues across party, because it's in the interests of the whole of the United Kingdom that there is no better deal than staying in the European Union, and I will fight with everybody to make sure that that option is on the table.
One in the front row here, and then yes.
Very much. Romilly Weeks, ITV News. To Dame Margaret and Ian Blackford, first of all, you're appealing to Jeremy Corbyn to call a vote of no confidence in the government. Why would he not do that at the moment when it has most chance of actually bringing the government down? And if I can also ask Anna Soubry as well.
Could I ask people to confine themselves to one question?
Can I ask Anna? What, in your view, is the biggest obstacle in the way of a second referendum now?
To be honest, I've almost forgotten what you were asking me. I think basically people have to think about what is the best timing, and people are considering that, and it's quite right that they do. Nobody wants this to be a flop.
You know, I think we are facing a crisis, and let's reflect on what happened last week. The government lost 3 votes in 2 hours. That hasn't happened since 1978 under the Callaghan government. This is now a government that's in chaos, that's in crisis. And I think all of us have got a duty to respond to that. And that's why I would appeal to Jeremy. We have no option, I believe, other than to put down that motion of no confidence. We have to appeal to the House. I think that's what people throughout the United Kingdom would expect of us. And I will ask Jeremy Corbyn to reflect on that We have the SO24 debate today. Let's get through to the closure of that. We cannot delay. And if Jeremy doesn't accept that responsibility, then I'm afraid the rest of us will have to accept that responsibility and lay down that motion of no confidence, because we're not prepared to accept that what we have is a government of chaos, a government that is failing to get much legislation through, a government that's failed in many respects to get its budget through. It is time to call a halt to this.
The biggest obstacle to a people's vote at the moment, I'm afraid to say, is Jeremy Corbyn. That's why that slogan is right. If not now, when, Jeremy? And he's got to start this process now.
I call the woman here. Second row. Yes.
Hi, Lizzie Buckham from The Independent. You're calling on Jeremy Corbyn, obviously, to table no confidence motion. Have you got a deadline for him? Is it today, end of the week, before Christmas?
I think time is of the essence. I think Jeremy, and I will have a conversation with Jeremy this afternoon, but I think Jeremy has to do that by the close of business today. I don't think the people will expect us to delay on this for too long.
Okay. Yes.
Sky News, this is to Margaret Beckett, please. Isn't the truth that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't want to call a vote of no confidence because Jeremy Corbyn doesn't want a second referendum? If neither front bench do, you can't make it happen, can you?
Might be the Tories.
It's clear that our preference would be for a general election, but I think from various things that Jeremy has said lately, no, I don't think that is correct. I don't think it is the case that Jeremy doesn't want a second referendum. But in any case, or a people's vote, or whatever you want to call it, but in any case, it's perfectly right and proper, no matter what the timing is, that people begin to make preparations for that possibility. This whole process has been bedevilled by people kicking decisions down the road and then doing things at the last minute, and then there's a mess. We don't want that with a people's vote.
You're not going to get the Prime Minister to back a people's vote ever, are you?
Really? She said she wouldn't call a general election. She said we'd be having a vote today.
Could I just say, Jeremy Corbyn runs the risk of being seen to condone the chaos for his own possible benefit, because if he's out in March, at the end of March, on a no-deal Brexit, he gets to pass the buck to somebody else, and he gets to walk into a situation that some of us are wondering maybe he would be more comfortable with, given the degree he hasn't fought with passion for the European cause so far.
Yes.
Glenn Campbell, BBC. Tana Subri, are you calling for a vote of no confidence in the government? But first to Ian Blackfoot, aren't you setting the Labour Party up to fail by calling for a vote that you can't be sure of winning?
Well, Glenn, we have to fight to make sure we can win this. This is a government of chaos. It's a government that's not functioning. And I think Parliament has got to do its job. I would appeal to all parliamentarians to recognise where we are. Let's have this vote of no confidence. Let's make sure that we have that as a lever, that we can get to a destination of having a people's vote, that people have got the choice to rescue us from this crisis that remain within the European Union. This is the way to do it.
On the conference motion, and you can be assured that when that vote of confidence comes, I will be voting in support of my government. Yes.
Hi, Adam Payne from Business Insider. Minutes ago, Anna Subri said that lots of her colleagues couldn't support a Norway-style Brexit. I'm just wondering whether that applies to every other member of the panel, i.e. if a Norway-style exit became a possibility further down the line, would every single member of the panel vote against it?
I think the key I don't think that, to be perfectly blunt about it, I don't think it matters at the moment what particular deal any of us fancies. What matters is whether or not there are two credible and deliverable options on the table, and whether or not the people are given the right to choose. If we get that agreement to prepare for that, then people will have all sorts of ideas about what the two options ought to be. But we're not in that position at the moment. And I think, yes, I'll take you because you had your hand up at the beginning, and then I think colleagues are wanting to get off. Yes?
Dan Saber from The Guardian. Question to the panel broadly. I think you were talking about a two-part question, but isn't a three-part question fairer, given what you've guys said, the Prime Minister said, the choices are between, no deal, no Brexit, and whatever's left of Theresa May's deal?
No, the no deal should not be on the ballot paper. It's a complete nonsense. I mean, the whole original thinking behind it was that the government needed to have the no deal option in order to confront the European negotiators. But they've finished their negotiations with the European Union. The only basis on which a no deal could happen is if the government itself makes a deliberate decision, we're going to crash this vehicle, and precipitates a no deal option. It's not realistic, it's not sensible, it causes immense damage, and there's no justification, whatever, for just putting it down as an option. We're very clear that there has to be the option of remaining within the European Union, albeit reformed. And there is a specific option on the table from the government, which may be slightly modified, and that is the alternative. We shouldn't be confusing the matter with third questions, which are entirely hypothetical and nonsensical.
And I repeat, I think we're all of the view that what needs to be on a ballot paper are two credible and deliverable options. And with that, so that colleagues can get to the debate, I'm going to thank you all very much for coming and draw this press conference to a close.